we'll just start talking, and then I'll ask you to give kind of an overview of your background. And I might, just because it's so historic, mention that we're shooting this right after the inauguration. Maybe I won't. I haven't decided how to go with that going forward. It's a goal of mine to be infinitely less political, at least through the show, just because I don't think it works.
Yeah, definitely. But I was hearing this quote because I did my launch event with Erin Entrada Kelly. Like, she's amazing. And she was saying about how joy should be an act of resistance. And so, I was launching my book during a really, really turbulent and uncertain time, like very clearly uncertain time. And it was during that really, I think I don't know if this is live, but I think I released my book the day the impeachment happened. And so it was just a lot going on in that week, but she was like, people still need good stories out there. So sorry, this is my weird soapbox about kind of talking about current times, but I think that kids still probably want to read like good literature.
No, I agree. I think we should leave that in. I think we should consider that the start of the show. Hi, everybody. So we are recording this. You'll be listening to it January 30th, or I don't know, whenever you got around to it. We're thrilled you found us 5 years later, whenever. But we are recording this January 21st. We're doing a first ever stealth intro. It's a brand new season, episode 101. We're up to new tricks on Middle Grade Ninja. Keep them guessing. So here you are. This book released, January 12th?
Yeah.
My guest, Christina Li, everyone. The book releases January 12th, 6 days after an insurrection on the Capitol. And so you keep your head down and just turn the news off so you're not focused on any of that? Or how do you handle the stress of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a debut season is always a pretty stressful time for the author. And then it was compounded by a lot of other things kind of going on in the world. And so I think that one of the things that I was thinking about when I was creating was, I think that kids always want to read books. Kids always want to find joy in these times and joy and hope. And also I think my existence as an author and kind of my books are always as an act of resistance to kind of, white supremacy and oppression. And I just really want to kind of be able to get my work out there. And so that was kind of how I went into my debut week. I just really wanted to create stories that kind of make kids feel seen and heard, and kids from a lot of different backgrounds feel like they could kind of trust a story and find some source of hope and joy.
I 100% agree with you, of course, but for people who are listening, who haven't been writing for a few days, guilty. I did some writing today on the 21st after inauguration. Yesterday, I watched the inauguration, and the day before, we were scheduled to record this originally because I didn't know we were going to be swearing in a president right after an armed insurrection. Timing. If I'd known, I wouldn't have scheduled any conversations for January. Because why would I want to capture my terror on tape? So look forward to that next two episodes, esteemed audience, that were recorded previously. You can hear some of that terror in my voice, I think. But for folks who are listening who haven't been writing, how is creating something an act of resistance against white supremacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was in my launch event with the wonderful Erin Entrada Kelly, author of these incredible books, Hello Universe, I think We Dream of Space most recently. And she said that joy is an act of resistance. And that was something that was really incredibly important to hear at that time. And my books, I think, I'm always trying to kind of diversify the narrative. I know that children's literature, when I was growing up, when a lot of people were growing up, it was not quite very diverse, and it didn't kind of reflect a lot of the voices that really did want representation and did want to kind of see their narratives reflected in books. And so I write about Chinese American characters, and my characters are really near and dear to my heart. I like writing about my culture in my books. And to me, that is kind of my act of resistance and my act of joy. I like putting things that, I think are worth hearing about, that little Christina would have loved to hear about as a kid. And so for me, it's a really tough time to kind of be creating and to kind of have to sort of cope with everything going on. But I just at the end of the day, I want my stories, you know, to kind of reach people and reach audiences and kind of reach out to those like little Christinas of the world.
Plus, there's those pockets of ignorance out there that you're going to stamp out because they're going to read Clues to the Universe, available now, and they're going to have to go forward with that knowledge, with at least some empathy for the characters in this story, that might lead them to think, if I could have empathy for fictional characters, maybe that could extend to people in real life. Who knows what could happen?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Just kind of developing, you know, empathy and kind of including more perspectives in children's literature. I think I'm always all for that.
Would you, I had planned to slow walk us through this, but we're here. And I want to learn the process that brings young Christina Li, because you've described yourself as a shy and fearful child. Now you're on this podcast. You've also said that you were reluctant to embrace the culture of your Chinese American immigrant family, is how you phrased it.
Yes.
So what changed, and when did it change that you're at least enough over your shyness that you're here, and that you've written a book about your about someone's Chinese American immigrant family?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was an incredibly shy child. I was the kind of kid that we had like these popcorn reading kind of exercises in school where you like read and then you'd like pass it on to the kid behind you. And I was so scared that I would plan out my like lines. So I would be prepared to say my one line when it got to me. Like it was just like those levels of like childhood anxiety. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I was always, you know, on the shyer side. And as a result, I kind of probably turned to books. Those are probably correlated. And I loved kind of escaping in the pages of a book. I loved reading stories. I read through the shelves of my local library. I had the best childhood librarian ever. And so, I mean, I was reading those books, but I wasn't seeing myself in those books. I was reading narratives about other people who didn't really look like me and who didn't really kind of come from my background. And so it was very kind of, it was like spectating. It was kind of very passive reading. But then when I was, I think in, fifth or sixth grade or something, I read Grace Lin's Where the Mountain Meets the Moon. And that is kind of the reason why I love kind of having, you know, narratives in children's literature that kind of are diverse and have diverse representation, just because that book was life-changing for me. I mean, it was the first book that I'd read that had a character of kind of Asian descent and someone who was the main character. And reading that book and seeing Grace Lin's picture on the back cover, it really made me think like, like these are characters who look like me and who, you know, whose culture I can really relate to. And she's front and center, like she's the main character, she's the hero of this story. And not only that, but you know, here is a Chinese American author writing these stories. And so after I read that book, it just something clicked in me. I think I started, you know, reading more books and I started writing novels. And from that point on, I mean, it's a long process kind of overcoming, you know, childhood fearfulness and overcoming, you know, your shyness and finding a voice. But that really was the beginning of it all. And that kind of was the book that inspired me to want to become an author.
Wouldn't it be great if, like a movie, you could identify the one pivotal moment, the one scene that before this, fearful, afterward, not so much?
Yeah, I mean, it was much more gradual, I think, than my like 30-second kind of explanation of this whole thing. But it really was, I mean, I could very like vividly remember like where I was when I read that book, and like kind of like everything that was going around me at that time. It really was kind of that pivotal moment, even if things took a little longer to kind of develop before and after.
Let me ask you this question for any publishers who might be listening. After you read Grace Lin's book, did you say, my God, wonderful, breathtaking, that'll do, that's all we need of that voice, let's go back to standard heterosexual white people fiction from here on out? Or was there a yearning for more?
Yeah, so I mean, it was an entire paradigm shift, right? Like before that, I didn't even register that that people like me could become the main character. I mean, it sounds silly now because because I'm writing books with like Asian American main characters. But at that point, I truly was like, oh, like this is, you know, this is possible. Like you could have someone who's Chinese and like Chinese in a book. Like you could have books with like Chinese characters. And so that was just, it took a while for me to wrap my head around that. And after that, I kind of, like after I was exposed to that, I was looking for that everywhere I went. I mean, I loved furthermore, like reading Melinda Lowe and like Cindy Pond's YA when I got older, and then kind of reading even more like middle grade and YA that had Asian American characters or characters of Asian descent. I just wanted kind of more. I mean, I read Grace Lynn's book and I was like, this is a wonderful book. Like, first of all, I want more Grace Lynn's books, but also I want more books with like characters who are Asian and have, you know, a variety of Asian perspectives. Yeah, I actually, I'm in a writing class in my school. And one of the things we talked about today was about how Asian stories and Asian American stories are not necessarily monolith. And so, I mean, I loved her book, but I also wanted other books that, you know, touched on a variety of topics. And so, yeah, I'm glad that over the years it has gotten a little bit more diverse, but I would still love to see kind of even more like books with like Asian main characters coming out in the future.
That is something I've heard several authors on this show say, and several authors on other shows. Don't worry about those shows, esteemed audience. This is the only show you need. I know when Hina Khan is most recently, I'm thinking of when she was here, she almost, she had her own very similar experience in that she would write about, I think she said she would write about white characters initially before she felt comfortable writing about her own family and her own culture. Mm-hmm. I think that has become just a universal issue that hopefully is going to be stamped out. One of the things that Clues to the Universe is going to be stamping out in addition to ignorance is that feeling of isolation, hopefully, for readers. What do you imagine that if this book had been available at your awesome library when you were growing up? I want to know what made the library so awesome, but what would Clues to the Universe have offered you, and what are you hoping that it's going to offer to readers who are picking it up now?
Yeah. So I mean, I was lucky enough to have the best like middle school librarian in the whole world. She bought every single book that we requested, and I had these like long PowerPoint slideshows about books that she was recommending. I think she read like a book a day. She was incredible. Like, I dedicated part of the book to her in the acknowledgments just because she was so influential on my decision or my ability to become an author. But I think that, I wrote this book as a love letter to kind of Asian American kids and put in little things that I would have loved reading in a book when I was a kid. And first of all, this is a book about kind of, like you said, like isolation and solidarity and friendship and overcoming kind of the growing pains of growing up in middle school and overcoming grief and everything. And so it would have provided Shy Christina with a really, hopefully heartwarming friendship story. But moreover, I think I put in those little like Easter eggs that reminded me of my childhood. I mean, it's really small details. It's, the food that they eat, kind of, I put in my like fair share of Chinese pastries in there because I love Chinese pastries. Like small like nicknames. Rose's mother calls her. Her mother calls her Baba, which is like a nickname for like treasure, like my little treasure essentially. And so I hope that if I were a kid and I was reading this, way back when, little Christina in that library, I hoped I could have seen myself and been able to kind of relate to the things that were happening in the book and seen a character who kind of was like me and had, the same cultural background that I did. So I really hoped it could give kids kind of, Chinese American kids, like, make them feel seen, but also hopefully it feels like a hug, essentially. I think that's what I've said I wanted my book to feel like.
I love that. I think every book's a little bit of a hug, but yeah. I love the idea of a very specific hug. Oh, Christina Li saw me.
Yeah, exactly. My brand of hug.
Am I talking to you early enough in the process that you've heard back from any earlier readers yet?
Yeah. So one of my favorite things ever, like, it's just hearing back from people who've read my book, especially like it means so much to me when it's, you know, early readers who've read it and like, they've like, you know, I don't really read my reviews. I think the book more so belongs to kind of the public. It belongs to the world now. And I'm not really a part of that. But sometimes people write nice reviews and tag me in them on Twitter, which is really, really heartwarming, because I've heard reviews in which people, some Asian American readers are like, you know, this was so like, I felt so close to this book essentially, and readers who kind of, you know, related to kind of also the friendship component. It was like, you know, this book is a very specific narrative, but I think it really touches on the universal themes of friendship and finding your best friend, and overcoming grief, and making people feel less lonely. And I think it really resonated with some early readers, and I'm really glad that I've been able to kind of read really, really nice words so far.
Well, I want to talk more about Clues to the Universe. I've got all kinds of questions about how you crafted it, about Ro and Benji and all of that. But I know esteemed audience loves a good how I became an author story, and I don't want to deprive them. So when does it occur to you that you want to be a writer, and then that you specifically want to write for a younger audience? Or is this just a book for a younger audience that you're writing, and now you're going to write adult romance or whatever going forward?
Not quite yet adult romance. I think I'm still very much in the kidlit space. But I wanted to become a writer, I think, around when I was in 6th grade. I think, you know, I was reading books and I was loving them. And I think one day it kind of just weirdly clicked. It was like, okay, well, if you love these books so much, like, why not write them yourself? And I started writing, and for some reason, I mean, I just jumped immediately to novels. I don't know why I took on kind of seemingly the more ambitious task of like finishing a novel as opposed to like finishing a short story or poem or something. But I think I just love books so much that it was just me trying to like kind of emulate that. And I mean, yeah.
Real quick side question: is that a quality that's true of you in life in general, that you'll throw yourself in the deep end, or is that just true for your comfort zone with books?
I think it's most true in my writing. I mean, sometimes I push myself in other ways to kind of like reach for the stars, but books, I really just went all out there. I didn't know how to write a book. I had read books. I didn't know how to write one, but I participated in this thing called National Novel Writing Month. And I think that was the best kind of training program for me, essentially. A lot of my writing is self-taught. And so I was just like, okay, like I have a month, you know, can write. I think my goal for that, it usually is 50,000 words, but I think it was like 30,000 or something. Like, I'll write 30,000 words in this month and we'll see how it goes. I mean, a lot of times my book endeavors are just me wanting to like write like a practice book, I think. And then it like magically becomes a real book. I mean, that's what I did for my first draft. I was like, here's my like practice novel, like first ever practice book. And then it turned into a full draft. And then with Clues to the Universe, I hadn't written middle grade before. Actually, I'd previously extensively only written YA. And so I was like, well, like, I don't know how to write a middle grade book, but this is going to be my practice book. And so I was lucky enough that it turned into a fully formed book, because not all of my books do that. A lot of my books kind of don't have endings, or they fall apart, or they're shelved or something. But every once in a while I kind of get a gem, and then I run with it. And so, yeah, I started writing books, and then wrote a couple, you know, as I mentioned, I was writing YA, I was writing kind of all sorts. I think I had my like dystopian phase when everyone was like reading dystopian. Exactly. It was like 2012 was a very specific time period. And so eventually, I mean, I got an agent, I after a lot of querying and pitching and stuff. And then my first book actually didn't sell on sub, which happens a lot in publishing. And so kind of shelved it, back to the drawing board. And then that was kind of when the idea for Clues to the Universe came to me the summer after my high school graduation. There was a lot of fresh starts going on in my life. And I was like, you know, kind of almost a little burnt out at that point from writing, because I didn't know what I wanted to write and where I was going next. But then the idea for Clues came to me, and I just had to write the book. So that is how I became an author.
So we gotta pump the brakes for just a moment. You say high school graduation, but you've already got an agent, and you've already had one novel go out on submission and written some others. So yes. that first NaNoWriMo one, did you hit your 30,000 count or whatever it was? And how old are you when that happens?
Yeah, for my first NaNoWriMo, I don't know, I don't actually remember if I necessarily hit the 30,000 word count, but I remember that I finished the book in like 2 months. And so
Let's say yes.
yeah,
Support
let's
the
say
legend.
liberal with, yeah, exactly. A month and then some. So yeah, it was my first, it was like the biggest sense of accomplishment to finish my first book, because I was like, oh, I'm capable of doing this. So yeah, really neat feeling.
And that's what age were you? What
I think I
grade
was
were you?
12. I think sixth grade. I was 11 or 12 at that point. Yeah.
Outstanding. And then from there, is it just I'm writing from now on, I never stop, or was there
Yeah.
a period of nothing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wrote pretty consistently throughout middle school and high school. I as aforementioned, I had my dystopian phase, and then I was writing a bunch of fantasies at a time. I did NaNoWriMo pretty much every year. If I wouldn't do it during November, I'd do it during the like Camp NaNoWriMo of, I think, July or something. They have like a NaNoWriMo and then like a camp version every summer where you can be a little bit more flexible with your word count. And so, yeah, I was writing pretty consistently. And then I stopped writing when I had finished a novel that I was willing to revise and query. I think you have some kind of sixth sense as an author when you know a book is complete versus when it's like good and like has potential, or not necessarily good. My first draft was pretty bad, but just like a book that had potential. And so I revised.
Your first book written at age 12 was not a perfect work of art at that point.
Surprisingly, no.
Okay, fair enough.
It was, yeah, I was nowhere near Stephen King at that point. And so I think it was probably my third or fourth book that I wanted to revise, and I could actually picture it, seeing it on shelves. And so I revised it. And then that was the book that I ended up querying, eventually got my agent with. But yeah, it didn't sell on subs. So as I'd mentioned before, I had to kind of scrap it, go back to the drawing board, and that's when I thought of Clues.
So, okay. I'm trying to think how to follow that up. Are you, for all those who are listening who want to be the next Christina Li, what's your writing schedule that you're following around school and everything else that you've got going on? Because 12 to high school graduation to starting to write the novel that's going to be your debut, there's a lot of time that goes through there. What kind of writing habit and writing schedule did you develop during that time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I didn't realize how lucky I was in middle school. I had so much free time in middle school. Like, I just didn't realize. I think that was one of my more prolific times, just simply because I barely had homework, and it just was like really easy to find time. Once it got to high school, it was a little bit harder, but still, like, I think I wrote best kind of in large chunks of time. So I knew, certain days would be blocked off if I was particularly busy, but on the weekends I could spend a good 8 hours at, Starbucks, right, in like non-COVID times. Or like in college, I think it's a little bit harder just because the classes are a little bit more challenging, and it requires, I think, more like
So hi, Christina. It's Mabel's annual TV appearance.
Oh,
all right, Mabel, you're wrecking the story. We gotta go.
Not at all. I think Mabel just made it way better. Anyway, so in college, I think it's a lot more self-directed, and so something that's been working a lot for me is like I like rising early. So like I'd wake up probably around 7ish or something and like write, and then like I really like it just because I think when you wake up before the rest of the world wakes up, you kind of have a lot of time to yourself, and you're not like there's not a lot of distractions going on in your life at that part of the day. So I have transitioned into, I think, more of a morning writer for sure.
So what's that look like? What time do you start, and do you just start writing immediately? Do you have some kind of wake up ritual to get you where you need to be?
I used to think I had a ritual. Now it's just like as fast as you can get to the computer and start writing because time is ticking. For Clues, I remember very distinctly, I was working. So I wrote the book of the novel during the summer after my freshman year in college. And so I remember because I was working a job at that time. So my job started at 10 in the morning. I think I'd wake up maybe around 6:30 or so. I would write, for a couple hours. That was like the best way because it was when my mind was most clear. And then I would, eat breakfast or whatever, do my job. And then maybe I'd write after work, but that's not it. I did the bulk of my work during the morning. And so
Are you chugging coffee, tea, or just straight to it?
Drank a lot of tea. I like drinking coffee. I think it's weird because the older I've gotten, the more my body reacts to coffee. Like I get like very hyper anxious when I drink coffee. So not as much anymore. But yeah, I drank a lot of, I think, green tea or something when I was writing this book. So it was me, my cup of tea, you know, my computer at like 6:30 in the morning. And I'd have like 1 or 2 peaceful hours to myself. It was great.
And then do you keep a word count that I hit this? How do you know you had a good day?
Yeah, so I organize my writing with scenes. So normally I would write 1 or 2 scenes during like a writing session, and so I usually know it's like been a good writing session when I hit, I think, 1 scene or 2 scenes or something. My word counts vary. I've come out of, you know, writing sessions having written like 4,000 words and writing sessions having written 500 words, and both of them feel equally rewarding in a sense. I remember when I was just writing Clues, like I had written like long books before, but with Clues, I was just, I think, at a very like lost point in my writing life. And so I was like, it sounds dramatic, but I was like, was not sure if I was able to write a book again. And so with Clues, I remember each writing session, I literally wrote like 300 words or something, but like I held on to those 300 words because it shows because my drafting of Clues is actually very clean. I think I maybe did 1 revision before it sold to a publisher. And so it was those 300 words, right? And like eventually those words add up. So yeah, I think I don't judge it really by word count. I judge it by kind of how significant that scene is to me and if I feel like that scene is complete or not.
I like that. That's excellent. A couple of follow-up questions. Then I do want to talk about Clues to the Universe. But how does one go about selecting and finding a literary agent before one graduates high school?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. So I was querying for a while. I went through the whole like, you know, sent out a bunch of queries, got a bunch of rejections, sent out a bunch of queries, got a bunch of rejections, that whole spin cycle. And so I learned a lot though. I remember I queried a couple of agents and they were, you know, incredibly like reputable, like agents who clearly had sold amazing books and they were very busy, right? Because that's what I assume. Like agents have so much like work to do on top of work, on top of all this, they're reading and trying to negotiate deals and stuff. But they took the time out of their day to write me like the nicest long rejection ever. And I received, I think, 2 incredibly kind rejections. I think one of them was over a page long, in which this agent had she had no obligation to me, like this like random writer that she'd never met before. Like it was, she took it upon herself to write me like all the things that she thought were wrong with my book in a really constructive way. And so I really valued that area of the querying process just because I got amazing feedback, even if I was getting a lot of rejections as well. But
when you got that letter, did you take a day to be like, or was it just straight to hooray?
No, I was not straight to hooray. I was definitely like, oh no, because I mean, it's always sad when you get a rejection. It's never like happy, but I think, you know, a couple years out, you know, hindsight is 2020. I think that book definitely would not have gotten into the shape that it would have gotten an agent with had it not been for those very lengthy rejections. I mean, also a lot of the rejections were not helpful. A lot of them were just like no response or like, oh, sorry, like, which was fair. They're objective. But yeah, so I got a lot of rejections. And then I actually pitched to my agent at a Writer's Digest conference. I think when I was like 15 or 16 or so. And I, you know, pitched to her and I was incredibly nervous. Again, goes back to the very shy Christina, scared of public speaking kind of thing. So it was like the scariest thing I've ever done. And also it was like pitch a novel in like 30 seconds, which was like even scarier because I didn't have time to, you know, mess up or ramble or anything. But luckily she requested my manuscript and then I revised it for a little bit. Actually, I don't really recommend this, but I realized the book wasn't ready. So I like pulled it to revise a little bit, submitted it to her probably a year later, and then she offered me representation. So yeah, that was the timeline of how to get a literary agent. I recognize it's probably a little unconventional, but yeah, that's kind of my process.
You don't recommend the totally effective thing that you did that resulted in success?
I probably not, honestly. I don't recommend, I recommend querying with a very complete novel. I don't recommend finding out through your rejections that your novel is actually pretty incomplete in revisions. So
well, in defense, I assume when you sent the novel out originally, it hadn't dawned on you that it was anything less than perfect.
Yeah, exactly. It was top tier. I was like, this is ready for the shelves.
it's put it next to Dickens. It's time.
Exactly.
Do you mind saying the name of your literary agent?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Jess Riegel, Helm Literary. I love my agent. I want to put it on record that my agent's amazing.
And I believe Jess Riegel has a 7-question interview available now at middlegradeninja.com. And Miss Riegel, if you're listening, come on the show. I'd love to talk to you. So now you're armed with a literary agent. The first novel that you took an extra year to revise and went through query hell to make perfect doesn't sell, but you don't get disheartened, or you do get disheartened for a moment. And if so, how do you overcome it?
Yeah, I mean, I got pretty disheartened. At that point, it's like, it's up to the industry, right? Like, it's, my agent had done everything she could in her power, and like, she's, you know, amazing, and really went and fought for me. And it just, there were a couple reasons why it didn't do well. And I mean, that, and also it's just a very subjective market. So yeah, it didn't sell. I was like pretty crushed, actually, because you know, whenever you get to that stage of submission, you're almost so close. You can almost feel it, right? Like the fact that editors are reading your book, like that's the final stage, which makes it all the more heartbreaking when they reject you, because you're like, oh man, like I really made it all this way. Like I don't know if this is like an apt comparison, but like, or if you watch American Ninja Warrior, but like, it's when they've made it through all the obstacles and they're at the final obstacle, and then they fall, and you're like, man, like you really went through that for everything for you know, you to fall. Like it's just, yeah. So I mean, it's rough, and it's also rejection, like I'd mentioned, is like also not great as well. And so I took some time, definitely. And that was kind of the period where I wasn't sure quite what I would write next. And I wasn't sure what kind of a writer I wanted to be, and what I wanted my next work to be. And so I took some time, you know, and then eventually the idea for Clues to the Universe came to me. So it was all very kind of serendipitous, but taking some time off definitely really helped in terms of me writing and kind of resetting.
I want to point out that I have watched multiple seasons of Ninja Warrior, and it has never come up on the show until 101 episodes in. What have I been doing? What have we been talking about? Fantastic show.
Yeah.
So you're pivoting. What makes you think that middle grade is going to be a better spot for you, at least for this first novel, rather than YA? And since it sounds like there's a story behind it, how does the idea for Clues to the Universe come to you?
Yeah. So I'd always wanted to write middle grade in a sense, but I was always really scared of writing middle grade, because I idolized middle grade books when I was a kid. I mean, I was reading all those Rebecca Stead books. I was reading all those kind of books off the shelves. Like I loved them and revered them so much as a kid that I just didn't want to ruin middle grade. Like I wanted to write a good book too. And so it was always at the back of my mind, but I didn't realize until Clues, you know, because with a middle grade book, I mean, as with every book, but like middle grade book, I felt like there was a pressure. I especially with contemporary, I had to be really, you know, insightful and witty and funny and like mature, but also in a way that kind of kids could understand. Like it's really, really like intricate work to be a middle grade writer. And so I always was too scared to approach it until Clues. I was like, this Clues to the Universe is definitely a middle grade novel. And I realized that because the idea for Clues to the Universe came to me when I was thinking of this girl who was trying to process, you know, logically the events of her father's death. And she was a scientist, I knew that. And I knew that she would have a really, really hard time processing it, because grief is not at all kind of a scientific or logical or linear, you know, thing to kind of work through. And so that was the first thing I thought of. And then the second thing I thought of was Benji, the artist, who would kind of be, whose narrative would parallel Rose. And I knew that they would be both kind of missing their fathers, and the components of the plot came to me. But I knew that it could not be anything but a middle grade novel, because it just dealt with kind of, the voice was middle grade. Like it had the sense of wonder that a middle grade book would have, the sense of, you know, kids at that age. I mean, I remember being 12 and thinking kind of the world was at once like my oyster and like was super conquerable, and also the world was so like hard and weird to navigate, and things such as like getting a bad grade on a test or like facing a childhood bully seemed just as big as like, you know, topics of like can I go to space? And so I just wanted to capture that in a middle grade book, and I think that was how the idea for Clues came to be.
Did you have without becoming the hard-hitting, now's the time for you to cry reporter, which I try never to be, but was there something specific that happened in your life that said, okay, for my writing now, I need to be talking about grief and the processing of grief? Mm-hmm. What triggers you to focus on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Clues isn't directly inspired by my life, and so the things that happen to my main characters are different than the events that happened to me. But I mean, the previous winter, I'd actually lost my grandmother, and that was my own process of grief that I had to kind of work my way through. And that's actually something that's influencing the book that I'm writing, the middle grade book that I'm writing right now after Clues. And so it's just, I think, in terms of kind of grief and friendship, I remember those feelings as a kid. Like I remember the feeling of finding your best friend. I remember the feeling of kind of wondering about like the big questions. I did science fair as an 8th grader. And so it's very much like you know, from my own experiences, and kind of with the tougher topics. I think I tried to, they weren't directly based on my life, but I did try to approach it with kind of the sensitivity that I hoped would come across, because I knew it was a really sensitive subject and I knew it was tough, but I hope that I handled it in a manner that kind of resonated with readers and felt true.
That resonated with me. I've got all kinds of questions for you specifically about how to be responsible when you're talking about grief with middle grade. I want to talk about the characters. I want to talk about voice. But before we do any of that, for a poor esteemed audience who hasn't had the privilege of just reading your book, what esteemed audience, publicists don't send you free books? Oh, it's so great. You should definitely get on this free book train. If you would, I never summarize other people's biographies or other people's books. It's my policy, because I want to be friends with all the writers that I've talked to, and that's a good way to make sure we stay that way. So if you would, tell esteemed audience kind of an overview of Clues to the Universe, so they know what to expect as they're pre-ordering just buying their copies. It's available now, just buying their copies while they're listening to us.
Yeah, exactly. It's a real book form now. Clues the Universe is a middle grade historical fiction. So it's set in 1983 in Sacramento, California. And it's about a 12-year-old Chinese American aspiring rocket scientist, Ro, who is kind of grieving her father's unexpected death. And she becomes unlikely friends with this really shy artist named Benji. And together they kind of set out to help build Ro's model rocket for the science fair, and to also search for Benji's long lost father through a trail of his space comic books. And so that's kind of what my book is about. And it kind of, it deals with themes of friendship and grief and found family, and kind of the big questions of the universe, and also the parallel themes of when art meets science, and when different people meet each other and become best friends. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's kind of what my book is about.
Who's the ideal reader for this story?
I mean, it's just, the book says it's for readers 8 to 12, but I have heard from readers that, you know, that age range could expand a little bit. I hope it's for readers that, you know, the readers that were like me when I was a kid, kind of like browsing the shelves, looking for a book to read, you know, read a book, and someone hoping to find a good story, but also hoping to, like I'd mentioned, like have a little hug at the end from the book. And so, yeah, I just hope that kids of all ages find it, and also just, you know, kids who are looking for a story of friendship and family, and hopefully also, you know, some little Christina out there, you know, Chinese American girl who could eventually see herself in a book. So yeah, those are kind of the readers I have in mind.
And you mentioned the age-old, not battle, but the slight conflict between the artist and the scientist. And here I am, I'm talking to you, debut novelist. I think you've made it clear that you are a passionate artist who worked very hard, wrote multiple novels before you get to this debut. And yet I also know, because I read your bio, that you are studying economics at Stanford University, standard middle grade author fare. So are you the artist or the scientist or both?
Yeah, I think about that. And yeah, it's economics at Stanford is taught in a very like social sciencey manner. So with a lot of like numbers, it's not very business oriented. It's more like research oriented. So definitely bringing out the scientists and people. In terms of, I mean, it's just different parts of my brain. I think there are things that I apply from my writing to my classwork in economics, and there's things I apply from kind of my work, my classes to my writing. And it's really interesting to see how those things like could be compartmentalized and could be separated at times, but also could come together in like the back of my brain to like form new ideas. But yeah, in terms of what I'm studying at Stanford, I'm studying healthcare economics. And so it's that same narrative of kind of, I'm just passionate about like people's stories and even in terms of like really hard fast numbers, you can still draw a story out from the data that you analyze. And so I think that it really does come together. And I think that it also is well summarized by this thing that this quote that I heard from this one author event, in which she said, she was a former science professor, and she said that science and art are the same in that they both draw patterns out of chaos. And I think that that's just a beautiful quote that has stuck with me all this time.
Yeah, but with art, you don't have to prove it.
With art, there's no math. Exactly. Yeah. I will admit I'm not the a big fan of math, so there's that too.
I love the idea of studying economics, because I assume that you're bit hard enough by the bug that you and I are going to be doing another episode of this podcast years from now, and you're going to be on novel number 11. It is going to be amazing. So I'm just going to go ahead and pre-assume great things for you. But I love this idea of studying economics. I have a bit of a background in finance, and it was so helpful for me as a writer, because if I sit down, I'm a psychiatrist, I said, well, tell me about your particular issues. And then I go and I use that as the basis for a character. I'm a monster. But if I talk to you about your finance, and I say, tell me what's most important to you, what motivates you, and you're going to prove it because that's where you're going to put your money. And I'm going to know for sure that is what's most important to you. Well, there's no ethics breach there. What a fantastic way to learn about human motivation and behavior. So what does studying economics bring to your writing? And then we'll get back to the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you summarized it super well. It's just, I think that there's always, I think thinking about economics and thinking about writing is different. I think that, in both cases, I mean, if I'm working with data and trying to prove sort of a causal effect between certain things, right? Like, for example, certain, programs or like certain forms of spending and kind of their effects on like healthcare or something. You're looking for a story in that. Like, you're looking for something to write about. But it's very like on the paper, very kind of you lay all your cards out. For writing, it's actually very different, and that's kind of where the two different brains go off, because writing is kind of like revealing a secret. You don't really show all your cards at the beginning. You don't really sit your reader down and tell them like, this is what the story is about. You have them find it out for themselves. And so I think that in both cases, like studying economics and studying writing, it is all about storytelling. I think it's just telling the story in kind of different formats and in different ways.
That makes 100% sense. Plus, you'll have something that's a little bit more hireable than my English degree.
I don't know about this pandemic, though.
Well, we'll come back to the pandemic, because obviously we got to talk about how you're marketing during times of pandemic and economic strike and all the other madness that's happening in the world. But by God, let's talk a little bit about Roe and Benji. So why was dual perspectives the best way for you to tell this story?
I just knew that it had to be dual POV. I knew that their story would not be complete without the other. I mean, it was weird for me too, because I'd always, you know, written single POV. Like every single book I'd written beforehand, it was always just one character narrating. And so dual POV was definitely a really fun challenge for me, because it was like, how can I handle these two voices? But also I knew that the story had to be told through two people, because the way that their stories played off each other was crucial to kind of the wholeness of the book. It couldn't just be from the scientist, and it couldn't just be from the artist. So yeah, that was kind of, I think I realized very early on that it had to be two people's stories. It had to be two friends in conversation with one another.
So how much do you know going in? Do you have some idea of what the overall plot's going to be? And it's got to be set in 1983, and these have to be the characters? Or do you have just a slight inkling? How much are you flying blind when you get started?
Yeah. So for clues, I had the, you know, plot of the book, like the very bare bones. I knew that Ro wanted to build her rocket. I knew that Benji wanted to find his father. Those were kind of the two like big motivators that I was heading out with. I think that over the course of the book, there was a lot of tinkering with the plot, just because I don't want to sound too spoilery, but kind of there's a big mystery, and how they go about solving the mystery, right? Like finding the father, for example. I had to work that out a lot in my brain. I think that once I did like write a pretty bare bones outline though, and that was what I carried with me throughout the book. So once I had to figure it out for a long time, but once I started writing it and once I started seriously drafting it, it pretty much all came out in one draft. So there wasn't that much that had to be tweaking kind of between drafts.
Is this a NaNoWriMo type draft, or how long did the draft take?
Yeah, so the summer after my freshman year, it was, sorry, I got the idea summer after my high school graduation. I NaNoWriMo'd that for like 10,000 words or something that summer. And then I was like, okay, I feel like I'm ready to actually write the book. So the summer after my freshman year at Stanford, I wrote the entire book. I didn't actually do NaNoWriMo that summer. I think I knew that writing the book would take a little bit longer, just because I was working around a job. But yeah, I drafted it. And so I drafted, I think 2/3 of it. And then I drafted the last third during the winter break after my first semester, first quarter back or something. And so, yeah, between those two kind of, like big long breaks, I scraped together whatever time I had to kind of write the first draft of that. And then after that, I think it went to a couple of readers and then went to my agent. I got those notes back. And then at that point, the book was ready to go on sub.
So let's talk a little bit about voice, because we've got two very distinct voices here. And your characterization is, I felt like I knew both these kids, especially Benji, who loves his aliens and his comic books. Like, yes. I understand. But these are two very distinct voices. I'm assuming that doesn't happen immediately draft one. How do you refine those voices? Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, that was my agent's big note to me, actually. She was like, these kids sound too similar, like, please make them different, you know? And so that was the biggest thing that I think I had to work on, I think, other than the plot. And so for Ro and Benji, I mean, they're two very different people. I really wanted my writing choices to reflect that. So I employed some little tricks in my writing. I mean, for Ro, I always made her sound really factual and logical. So she always tries to quantify things. She never exaggerates. She always says things just as they are. Even with her emotions, she is always very factual about what she is expressing. I think she is easier to talk about her observations around her than to express her emotions. Like, she won't necessarily say I'm sad. She'll say, like, for example, something like, I noticed my dad's jacket in the box, like I went to go put it away. You know, small details like that. For Benji, I whipped out the fantastical. He exaggerates everywhere. He always says stuff like, oh my gosh, like that felt like a million billion years. Like it was so long, like class was so boring. He always is like imagining things, like always imagining some kind of like alien invasion. Like his mind just goes, his imagination is, you know, truly admirable. It really goes wild. And so I And also like Benji like always has these like sarcastic quips and kind of like, you know, when he was like, oh, I'd rather go to the dentist than like speak in front of class, just kind of these like little like witty remarks that was very, you know, unique to his character. So yeah, through those small little tricks, I tried to make them sound like they were distinct people, because they very much were. And so I wanted it to come across that
way. And then a few different questions on the back of that. Although I suppose I should ask, touch back on grief, because this is a book we've talked about is intended for younger readers who are going to be a little bit more impressionable. So when you're talking about grief and about some heavier subjects, what responsibility do you feel as the author for younger readers? Do you feel that you can well, yeah, let's cap it there. What responsibility do you have? What's the way to talk about grief with younger readers?
Yeah, I think I have a huge responsibility when it comes to portraying grief, especially for younger readers. And that's kind of the challenge with middle grade. It just kind of knowing what to express in a way that young readers can access it. And I think that required me to kind of develop some, you know, maturity and to develop some wisdom along the way. I knew that the grief had to feel real in the book. I knew it couldn't feel contrived. It couldn't feel really corny, or I knew I had to do it justice. And so I mean, I think like I'd mentioned before, Rose's story isn't mine. Benji's story isn't mine. They're very different kind of narratives, but I have gone through grief before, and I wanted to kind of capture the feelings that I felt as a kid, you know, dealing with grief, and I wanted to kind of be able to translate that to a book, and so yeah, I tried to capture it in the realest way I could possible, in a way that kind of felt real to me, and hopefully, you know, at that point, if it felt real to me, it'd feel real to other people, it'd feel real to my agent, it'd feel real to my readers. And so that those were things that I really kept in mind. But yes, I really wanted to deal with it in the right way. And I really wanted to deal with it in kind of a mature manner that would feel kind of, I think, authentic to younger kids.
And we've established during the course of this conversation that you were not alive during 1983. So unlike some authors who might be reliving their glory days when they set their book in the 80s, that's not what you're doing. What kind of research did you have to do to make sure you were authentic to 1983?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many details in the 80s that I was not aware of going into writing this book. I mean, one of the I was interviewing my friend's dad, or my friend's parents actually, because they were, I think, young, like in their 20s in the 80s or something. So they'd lived through the 80s, and they were mentioning, you know, details such as like, oh, you know, placing call to the city, the city right over nearby was different than placing a call all the way across the country, right? Like if you were stationed in Sacramento, you could potentially place a call to Los Angeles, but to New York was just like the bills would rack up, like it would collect so much money, right? And that was, I was not aware of this detail. I really grew up in an era that was like you could place a call to anywhere. Like even in my like late teenhood, like with my, you know, iPhone, you could like place a call to England or something. Like it was truly, I think, one of the smaller details that really stood out in my mind during that time. But yeah, just a lot of, you know, interviewing parents. And I actually got a copy of the Handbook of Model Rocketry, the 1976 edition. Because I wanted it to feel real. I wanted it to be the book that Ro would be looking at as she was building the model rocket. And so just small details like those, I really tried to kind of be faithful. And yeah, like even with like Ro's mom listens to a lot of 60s music just because she grew up during the 60s and 70s. So just even keeping in line with those details as well. I tried to make it sound like the 80s. I hope I succeeded. I hope it wasn't too anachronistic, but definitely was an effort on my part.
You mentioned you've got the book. Do you do things like your characters? I mean, will you try to dress like a character when you're writing their perspective? I know that might slow you down when you're doing it first thing in the morning to get it done right away.
Gotta get into my windbreaker, like.
Do you have like music that you listen to that reminds you of that character? Do you have a 1983 soundtrack going while you're writing this? What things do you do to get yourself there?
Yeah, I remember there was a day where I listened to Material Girl on loop. I was just in that like 80s mood, I think. So in terms of music that set me in the 80s, I think I listened to a lot more modern, just because my music tastes are like strange. They like range from like indie to like soundtracks. It's just all over the place, and so I don't think I have quite a refined taste yet, but yeah, I listened to some 80s music just to get me into the mood, and then also just kind of like the music. I had a very specific playlist for this book when I was writing it, so I relied on playing that playlist a lot.
A playlist that you're going to make public on Spotify?
It is public on Spotify, I think.
What's it called? Where can we find it?
It's on my like private Spotify account. I'm very bad at like, making like things accessible to the, so I think it's one of my like 200 playlists on my Spotify, but I can definitely link it on my website just as a oh, this is what Christina was listening to as she's drafting the book. But yeah, it included like tracks by like Pentatonics. It included like, I think like indie artists like the Shins. Like it was just very eclectic, I think, but I think it all, hopefully, it was a very personal playlist, so hopefully it translated into a book that evoked some of the feelings I was listening to when I was listening to the playlist.
It occurred to me after I asked that's probably a question I should scratch from the repertoire. That's too personal a question to ask a writer. What's the matter with me? That's
totally fine. I mean, it's open to if someone like search me up on Spotify, they would find me in my like other like 200 embarrassing playlists. But yeah, I mean, I don't mind. They can totally like go through that. But,
that might be something fun with your copy of Clues to the Universe as you're reading it. Listen to the playlist.
Yeah, I'll definitely link it on my website, though. That's a really good point.
Two more questions about Benji, and then we'll maybe start to think about wrapping things up. But Benji, into the comic books, well, obviously he's got a particular motive that we've been kind of hinting around, so I won't spoil for why he's so into comic books. But that led me to believe that you are at least a little bit into comic books. Can you foresee a time when you might write a comic book story? And if you could have any type of superpower, what would you have?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, I actually got into comics for writing this book. I knew my main character liked comics, and so I was like, I'm like very curious. Currently working through, I think, Marjorie Liu's Monstrous comic series, which is currently very good. But yeah, that was definitely a thing that I like picked up like for research, and then I like got into it. And in terms of writing a comic book, I'm a terrible artist. I'm no Benji. Like I stick figures only for my end. So I don't think I have it in me to write a comic book, but that sounds very cool. Like I'm very much in admiration of people who can draw and write at the same time. And in terms of the superpower that I would like to get, I've always thought about it. I think that always comes up during like icebreakers with friends and stuff, and every time my answer changes. But I think I settled on the ability to teleport. I would love to be able to go anywhere without any transportation costs.
I like that. Yes, especially once COVID's gone and you've got to do your author tours. My God, how helpful!
Exactly. Yeah. Instead of driving across the country, I'll just appear in a bookstore. Like, great.
Are you going to use your teleportation power to save people? Heck no! You could get hurt doing that. We're traveling on book tour.
Yeah.
I've always joked that maybe a great superpower for me would be just the ability to change channels on my television, but without a remote, without having to touch anything. So I couldn't be expected to save anyone with power like that, but would make my life marginally easier.
Right. With great power comes great responsibility. And I don't know if I can handle the responsibility of saving people.
Help us, Rob. Our TV is playing the wrong channel. Hold on, citizen. I got you.
Yeah.
So this is a question I ask everybody, but I know Benji would want to know the answer. Christina Li, have you ever seen a flying saucer and or a ghost?
Oh, that is so interesting. I don't necessarily have like a big, alien or ghost story, but a couple of days ago, I'm like living with a couple friends, and my friend like texted me because I was like upstairs and she was downstairs. She's like, there's a ghost in this house. And I was like, what? Because I'm very scared of the supernatural. Like I'm terrified of like horror movies and everything. And she was like, I hear pipes dripping. Like something's wrong. Like something's going on. And then, I mean, a couple of days later, we just found out it was like this like massive like leak in the house. Like it was, you know, plumbing had to be like fixed and everything. But yeah, that's my recent brush with the supernatural, just some leaky pipes. But I really was believing that like this was going to be my ghost encounter for a moment. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, nothing other super otherworldly has happened to me before or since. But I don't think there are no aliens out there. I think there's a possibility that there's some like extraterrestrial life, but I'll just leave that door open. Like maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't.
So you're not quite at Benji's level of belief then?
I'm not like, oh, I saw an alien today, but I very much, I'm like, yeah, I think aliens are out there. I'm, you know, not going to aggressively pursue this like hypothesis, but I'm open to the belief.
I don't know. I think that when you learn everything there is to know about economics, and there's there's a lull when you need some new information, that's the time.
Exactly. Just dabble in some space travel. Yeah.
And as a homeowner, I have to say, if I am hearing weird noises on the pipes, I would so much rather it be a ghost than water damage I'm going to have to pay for. Oh my God.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we found that out. Ghosts are probably cheaper to deal with for sure.
Take the ghost every time. Christina, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I have enjoyed getting to know you. I've enjoyed your book. And I know that, like I say, a few years from now, you're going to be back and you're going to be on book number 7. And I will have all new questions for you and you'll have all new ghost stories for me. It will be a wonderful conversation that I'm looking forward to. For tonight, my final question is always some variation on if there was some bit of knowledge you could go back and impart to yourself at age 12 or anywhere along your writing journey that you feel would have made a significant difference in your life, would have saved you time and might save time for all the aspiring authors who are listening to us now, what would you go back and tell yourself?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think I think I would just tell myself that like things happen in time and to be patient with my craft. I think it could be a personality trait, could be a personal flaw. Depends on how you look at it, but I'm a very impatient person. And so I'm always kind of running ahead of myself. And when I was younger, I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm writing my first book. I have to get it published within 2 years or something like that. I set some arbitrary timeline for myself. And I realized that I really have the whole rest of my life to write. And so I'm, always a writer. I'm always growing. I'm writing the books that I would not have been capable of writing when I was, 16, 17 or so. And so I just would tell myself to be patient with my craft and that things happen, not on the timeline that you initially assume, but that things happen if you put in the work for it. So, yeah.
I
don't want to tell her that I don't want to spoil it to my younger self that I would publish a book. So I think I'd keep that suspense, but I would tell her to be patient because things will happen in time.
Yeah, we don't want to get complacent.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to insert some weird space time warp in the space-time continuum or whatever it is.
But young you goes up and says, oh my God, I think it's something with the pipes. And it's not. It's you, like the Flash and Batman v Superman coming through the timeline and say, Christina, be patient. As an impatient person, would that have helped, you think?
That's a good question. Would that have helped? Would it have created an alternate reality? I think it would have. I mean, I think part of me just wants to go back in time and cheer myself on as a kid because I was like, yeah, you're doing it. You're not doing it well, but you're getting there. And so I could give myself advice as a kid, but also younger Christina was doing all right. I think she was trying her best, and that's really all I can ask of her, right? So yeah, I mean, I think she was doing okay as is.
Now here, the Christina that is no longer fearful and shy, who is out there loud and proud promoting her book. Where can esteemed audience find you online to learn more information about your playlist, follow you on Twitter, all that good stuff?
Absolutely. So all my information about me is on my website. It's ChristinaLiWrites.com. So it's just my name, writes.com. And then my Twitter, that's the same for my Instagram handle. And my Twitter is CLI Writes. So CLI Writes. And I hang out mostly at those places. You know, occasionally you'll find me maybe on TikTok or something, but those are kind of my main platforms. So yeah, love to interact with readers, teachers, librarians, everyone. And yeah, so that's kind of where I hang out these days.
And as always, esteemed audience, head to middlegradeninja.com. Get interviews with thousands of publishing professionals, authors, literary agents, editors, folks you would find interesting. Download your free copy of Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees. It will change your life. It's free. Go ahead. Before the podcast is even over, it could be on your Kindle. You'll be fine. And as always, God willing, I'm alive. I'll see you next week. Happy 2021.